Jobs front, Chris, I mean, what about skills development? Where does it come in with all of this, and what role do you see this initiative playing in that regard?
Actually, in my interactions with the people who are inside the government, we've discovered that actually there are initiatives that are undertaken by the Department of Higher Education to restructure the SETAs and to resuscitate technical colleges and to create linkages between industry and those institutions, because what has been noticed is that over time there's been too much emphasis on university education and less on those technical skills that were characteristic of what the apartheid government used to do in the past. So now we want to resuscitate those colleges and then link them through this IPEP, and that's where now the role of economic development comes in as a coordinating department in that front. Yeah.
Well, Laura, let's get straight into the funding aspect of this deal now. I mean, BUSA has also raised concern about the financing of this policy. Where else would the DTI be sourcing finance, and is it viable?
Well, we already know that for the first time in ever, that the National Treasury actually allocated a specific amount of funding to industrial policy support for the DTI, and that is definitely a first, and that's a positive note that we need to take into account. In terms of raising other funding, well, the DTI is definitely going to be working very closely in conjunction with the IDC. Quite a bit of the funding will be coming from the IDC. This amount is not clear at the moment, and as far as I understand, the DTI is actually sitting with the IDC at the moment and restructuring their policy and budget setup to ensure that they can allocate the majority of the funding to the support of the IPAP. Other areas where they're going to be looking for funding is obviously foreign direct investment, private equity, and obviously the private sector would be looking to support some of it.
Is there a role for institutions like the World Bank, sovereign wealth funds as well, and other UN development agencies to actually play here?
Yes, absolutely. I think that they would play quite a crucial role. I mean, obviously, we know that Eskom's already applied for a loan from the World Bank regarding, electricity infrastructure in the country. Definitely, if we look at other country studies, if we look at Brazil, sort of institutions such as the OECD have been very influential in sourcing funding for an industrial policy or macroeconomic policy implementation.
Dennis, we also have the option possibly of development bonds coming to the fore to raise capital. What uptake would you anticipate in that regard, where we would assume that we're looking primarily at institutional investors and they would need to know that their money is getting used correctly?
Well, it would very much depend how they're structured. Obviously, if they come with a government guarantee, then it would be, the offtake would be exactly the same. Obviously, if they're forced to take those development bonds, which would be the worst case scenario, there'd be offtake as well. Yeah. But bear in mind, again, that if you take in resources, then basically you're reducing resources from somewhere else in the economy. So, it could raise the cost of financing for the private sector, for example, which again is one of those hidden unintended consequences.
Let's get on to implementation, because we're running out of time and I can hear the clock ticking literally in my ear. On the ground, implementation seems to be this big challenge. It's the overarching challenge that faces this policy moving forward. I mean, Chris, it's due mostly to the apparent lack of common ground between Treasury and the DTI. What's your view on that?
I think that common ground, we hope that it will be closed during this administration, and the sooner it's addressed, the better. And the role of the National Planning Commission should come out clearly now that we've got these policy documents that are coming to the fore. We've got documents coming from the Department of Higher Education, we've got documents coming from EDD, and documents now coming from the DTI. We hope that the National Planning Commission will be set up to now begin to establish those synergies. And another issue that has been raised that is of concern is the procurement is so decentralized amongst departments that you don't know to what extent that departments complying with the actual requirements of the procurement processes.
Yep, we've also got a role, Laura, for the Economic Development Department, one would assume, because they have been allocated a budget, 340 million rand, to ensure policy coherence and coordination.
Yeah, I mean, the Economic Development Department, the whole purpose for their establishment is that there's policy coherence and coordination between the various government departments. And as Chris quite rightly says, you know, there's a lot of various government departments who have released a plan to government, including the Economic Development Department, Labour, Higher Education. And previously what we've seen is that there's been a large overlap in some of these policies, you know, and then there's always an issue of funding, who supports what. So hopefully with the, you know, with the implementation of the Economic Development Department, we're going to see a much more coordinated focus, a much more specific focus for each of the government departments, as well as you know, support for other government departments in various mandates.
Well, Dennis, certainly if all goes according to plan, and we're just hypothetically speaking here, let's bring it to the exchange rate. I mean, we've had Minister Rob Davies stress the need for a more stable and a more competitive exchange rate in the country. Are we correctly addressing factors like that which diminish the country's competitiveness, like a strong currency and industry's ability to actually deal with it?
Look, unfortunately, the currency is problematic, and it is volatile. It is strong. But I mean, we found certainly in our studies looking at similar countries that South Africa seems to do worse than other countries under the same circumstances. And I think it goes back to those underlying conditions. You know, the infrastructure, the labour markets, the skills, the education, all those sort of issues have a very material sort of impact. And competition issues, incidentally. I wouldn't rule out any of those. So, you know, my suggestion there would be, let's not focus on something that we can't realistically change that easily, but rather focus on the underlying problems.
Yeah, well, certainly focusing on that, I mean, if we're talking about material impacts, Chris, so we've been talking throughout this discussion now about procurements and the importance of this. Is this sustainable, or are we not just creating a false sense of competition where we're not employing free market policy necessarily?
Yes, in our view, issues such as the exchange rate play a big role, and in the document IPEP, deliberately the issues were left to be tackled by EDD because it's an economic policy development department. But just to say that the exchange rate has been found to be very critical. It depresses, as Dennis says, economic activity, and if it's not managed, then we may find ourselves undoing the IPEP that we have.
Well, certainly, Laura, just to end off with a major issue, we've run out of time here, the IDC and other development agencies are really being used to expand access to concessional funding at more favourable rates. But there are questions, and we heard it in the insert, being raised around other development countries' funding, saying that the IDC comparatively is more expensive. Do you see that being a major stumbling block?
Look, I mean, I think that it has been acknowledged that the IDC is slightly more expensive than other development finance institutes such as the BNDES in Brazil. But I think that you know, the DTI, along with Treasury, is working with the IDC to try and, you know, solve these problems. You know, I think we have to look at it from a positive point of view in that the IDC has been very instrumental in supporting a number of industrial policy initiatives in the past. Last year, they had a big focus on some of the DTI's implementation from the previous IPAP. And I think that, you know, let's hope that with the talks in place at the moment, that some of these issues will be solved.
Dennis, in a nutshell, of course, we are looking at a 3-year action plan here. I mean, with what we've been discussing, what's your outlook? Are you positive about the outlook and this actually taking flight?
Look, I think that it's good that we've got sectors discussing these issues and looking for solutions more actively, that there's more cooperation within government. I would be very unhappy, though, if this becomes an interventionist sort of policy and you must do this type of thing because of the unintended consequences.
Well,